In this documentary, we will explore nationalism in Southeast Asia by using 3 case studies. For the underground nationalism, we'll use the criminal syndicates of the Yakuza to explore how they affected nationalism in Japan. On the civilian level, we'll use the example of the Tiananmen Square protests to explore nationalism on the civilian level. Finally, we'll finish with nationalism on the paramilitary level with the example of the Shield Society in Japan. The Yakuza did not start out as the nationalist ideology that we are currently exploring today. However, they started out as the Bakuto and the Tekei, who were known as gamblers and peddlers in feudalist Japan. Around the early 19th century and the late 20th century, the Yakuza began to explore themselves into the nationalist ideology, playing more into military support and hate against the leftist group and communist parties. The Yakuza began to enforce their nationalist ideologies in 1928 in the March 15th incident, when the Yakuza was partnered with multiple government and paramilitary groups, such as the Toko, which is the Japanese Special Enforcement Group. Together with this group, the Yakuza and many other ultranationalist groups went out into the streets of Japan and started to arrest multiple communist and socialist supporters. It was a mass arrest of around 1,600 communists and supposed leftist activists. The March 15th incident marked a major turning point in Japan's political landscape, as the Yakuza pushed themselves further into the government and they began to enforce their nationalist power over the peoples of Japan. The mass arrest not only suppressed communist movement, however, it also led to a further proposition of the Yakuza as nationalistic enforcers of Japan. After World War II, nationalism in Japan experienced a sharp decline due to US-led democratization efforts. Many ultranationalistic groups, such as the Toko and paramilitary groups, were taken down. In fact, many of the Yakuza bosses, most prominently Kodama Yoshio, were taken into custody as being of suspected war criminals. The Yakuza's nationalist ideology did not reign supreme in Japan forever, as by 1991, the Japanese government began to enact multiple anti-organized crime laws that prevented multiple of the Yakuza's former business practices. This forced the politicians that they had once allied themselves with to slowly distance themselves from the Yakuza in order to get rid of that corrupt government image that they had been based upon. This gave the Yakuza considerable financial trouble, as they eventually began to push themselves away from the once great nationalist ideology they had and more into the organized crime that we see portrayed in common media today. With the Yakuza's tendrils so deeply entrenched within the political landscape of Japan's government, they not only began to back the nationalist politician, however, they began to threaten the similar socialist politicians, even going as far as trying to assassinate them. The Yakuza's nationalist power really consolidated when the LDP party of Japan was born. This consolidated the right-wing power into one political party, which was most common. These parties were most commonly backed by different Yakuza factions and different leaders, the most prominent being again Kodama Yoshio. The decline of ultranationalist groups in Japan did not last forever. As the US enacted new labor laws, protests, strikes, and rallies became increasingly more common. Communism was gaining significant traction in Japan. However, the US did not like this. They began to fear a communist revolution occurring in Japan. Making a quick decision, the US reversed their new policies, releasing many of the Yakuza officials back into the world and supporting these groups covertly through the CIA. This urged the Yakuza to lean more into their nationalistic tendencies and suppress leftist movements.
China was known for discrediting the Tiananmen Square protests that happened in 1989, starting in April. However, the Western media also got the wrong idea of what the protests were actually about. The Chinese government decided to label the protests as a protest for democracy. This was because democracy would be considered as anti-government and anti-the government that at least was in control at the time. However, the protests were actually about anti-corruption. The protesters were angry that Deng Xiaoping was a corrupted leader and he was not doing the job that they wanted him to do. Because of this, Deng Xiaoping took these protests as a direct attack onto his own ideas and his power and his leadership. This is why he labeled the protesters as counter-revolutionary and used this reason to justify the massacre that he committed on June 4th. The student protests started after the General Secretary at the time had died, General Secretary being Pu Yaobang. He was a very influential General Secretary and was known for purging corrupt officials out of office. After his death, a lot of the students felt that his memorial was not good enough for what he had done for the country. So they started taking to the streets and protesting for a better memorial for this General Secretary. This protest slowly started turning into an anti-corruption protest. The students then came out with 7 demands. The 7 demands being to reevaluate Hu Yaobang's memorial event, to turn back from the spiritual pollution from the West, and the idea of capitalistic ideologies, to allow freedom of speech and freedom of press, to show the income of the high-ranking officials and their families, to have freedom of protest in Beijing, to increase the funding of schools and the income of scholars, to make sure not to miscredit the protests of the Tiananmen Square. It showed what the protests were truly about. The protests were to promote anti-corruption, a love for their country, and a need for a better China. After the massacre, the CCP doubled down and started interrogating anyone that they thought might have been included in the protest or supported the protest. They would go to schools, institutions, workplaces, and even houses, interrogate people and make sure that they will not speak of the protests and what had happened there. Because of this, even decades later, most Chinese citizens either do not know what had happened in 1989 or they justify what had happened with saying that stability matters above all else. However, a few people still knew the true story and tried their best to tell people what had actually happened. People would write letters to the government to reevaluate how they saw the protests and how they credited them. They would demand that the government look back on it and realize that it wasn't a protest for democracy, but a protest aimed towards becoming a better country altogether. It was a protest that wanted to unify China and stop corruption within the government.
The Tatsunokai, or the Shield Society, was a paramilitary group or private militia funded by Yukio Mishima. In 1960 Japan, people thought that Japan was losing its traditional values. Yukio Mishima led the forefront of that thought. Yukio Mishima saw that the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution was influenced by Western powers after the defeat of the Japanese Imperial Army in 1945 and 1948. This constitutional code thought that Japan had no right to hold an army, to hold a navy, to hold any sort of military power within the world stage. Yukio Mishima wanted to reinstate the emperor back into power and reinstate the army back into power. And so he sought to go to the JSDF headquarters, rally up the members, and bring them into power again. So he created the Tatsunokai, the Shield Society. He first started off by recruiting 100 or 200 students. This wasn't viable for Yukio Mishima as it was too expensive, so he settled for a group of 30 to 40 men. Yukio Mishima funded them, he fed them, and he trained them with his connections in the JSDF. November 28th, 1968, Yukio Mishima and 4 students in the Tatsunokai decided to orchestrate a coup. The coup followed that Yukio Mishima meets a person that he already knows to talk about the already established trading plan of the Tatsunokai within the JSDF headquarters. Yukio Mishima decided to go to General Matsuda, the head commander of the JSDF headquarters in Ishigaya. Yukio Mishima met up with him in his office with 4 of his underlings, sat down right across from him, apologized to him, and had 4 of his students found him, tie him up. He then sent a paper stating his demands underneath the door where his secretaries were at. The secretaries, obviously not accepting the demands, decided to fight it out with Yukio Mishima and his underlings. Yukio Mishima and his underlings decided to fight against the secretaries until they all backed away, with one being injured. Soon, they followed the demands, and by 11 p.m., the whole headquarters was gathered around the front balcony of General Matsuda's office. And so Yukio Mishima went out into the balcony and spoke of his speech. The speech stated that the soldiers or the police officers were to follow the old traditional value of Bushido, where they were all samurai, where they all have to stop the westernization of Japan, how they should all praise their emperor. Throughout this whole stunt, nobody was listening to Yukio Mishima, and if they were listening, he was being jeered at. As he noticed that the crowd was not listening to him, Yukio Mishima said his farewells to the crowd. So he bowed 3 bonsais in the direction of the emperor's palace, went back inside, set down General Matsuda right in front of him, kneeled down, and committed seppuku, where he slit open his stomach and had one of his underlings grab a sword, brandished it, and cut off his head. The seppuku is known as a ritual of honorable death. And so he did this to symbolize the traditional values have died, and to symbolize his sorrow and regret for causing mischief within the Japanese government. Afterwards, Yukio Mishima and student-run groups heard of the story of where he decided to commit seppuku for the traditional values of Japan. And so he was given a rightful funeral procession where over 30,000 people joined up.
In conclusion, these case studies prove to us that nationalism is not only just one facet, it's an aspect of multiple different levels of our society. Nationalism can be expressed as not only corruption in the government, but also as
A notion of an honorable death through blood.
A symbol of hope for people.
and many others. Nationalism is the key. Alright. I don't know. Do you think it's going across? The Yakuza. Woohoo! I'm Mr. Song. However, they began to threaten the socialist politicians, even going as far as assassinating them.
We missed.